subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. Help promote and rank up my channel. So we're back to review Loki episode 5. And before we get into spoilers, I will spoil things. I'll just address the highlights, things that actually progress the story forward. But first, I just want to say that I don't get it. This show seems to be really, really liked, and it's got great performances. It's visually dazzling, some interesting set pieces. It certainly brings layers and depth to characters. Loki consistently being undermined, though, made to look second fiddle, made to look like that little boy that's just a loser that gets a participation trophy. This episode in particular, much like episode 3, is kind of the illusion of progress being made. There's a bunch of unnecessary filler and fluff that really stretches this out like Mr. Fantastic. And while this episode is littered with much like the show, with all kinds of Easter eggs and nods to interesting things in history, it's just pure fan service. Barely any progress made this episode. Did it need to be this long? Did it need to drag on like this? Most of this show, a lot of stuff could be cut and really progress this story forward. Let's just talk about this episode. So this episode, you've got Renslayer pretty much telling Sylvie that Loki is now where everybody goes once they're pruned, and where everything goes once it's kind of reset. This place where all timelines converge and meet at a dead end, and nobody ever comes back from it because there's this giant beast in there, this giant comic book beast alive in there. And that's where Loki is after he got pruned. Sylvia, surprisingly, Renslayer behaves like she doesn't really know what's going on in it until she betrays Sylvia. If Sylvia gets her hands on a temp pad and prunes herself, because nobody has a temp pad in this purgatory place where Loki is now with other versions of himself. And it's cool seeing all these other versions of Loki. I like Alligator Loki. I like President Loki, who seems more in line with what this Loki should be. But as this show's kind of a character study, Loki discovering himself, trying to change himself, become a better person. There's all kinds of interesting Easter eggs in this wasteland. You get Throggy, the Thor frog. Classic Loki is certainly the highlight of this episode. Very powerful individual that reveals that he created an illusion of himself. He actually survived the Thanos attack because they're more powerful than they realize, and he convinced Thanos that he actually got killed by him when he just went off into self-isolation. This place is stacked with Lokis because they're better survivors than everybody else that's getting wiped out by this matter-consuming beast alive. Some really interesting moments in there, some really interesting bonding moments, but when Loki realizes that none of these other Lokis are going to help him, he wants to destroy the beast, figure out how to get back to the TVA and save Sylvie because he's in love with Sylvie. Sylvie, like I said, comes to where everybody else is, this kind of doomsday wasteland, and in it, she's conveniently immediately picked up by Mobius. Just so convenient. So convenient. After President Loki comes in and they realize they were betrayed by Black Loki, whatever you want to call this Loki with the hammer. This leads to Kid Loki, Alligator Loki, and Loki and classic Loki escaping. They meet up with Sylvie, and then they decide they're going to enchant this beast. Sylvia wants to enchant this beast so they can take it down and get to whatever it's guarding, whatever it's protecting, whatever it's keeping them away from. A lot of weird little moments. Awkward kind of Loki and Sylvia sitting there awkwardly, too afraid to admit their feelings for each other that they obviously have. And there's these awkward, touchy-feely moments. Sylvia and Loki talk about maybe having a timeline together after this is all over. You get this moment between Owen Wilson and Loki as Owen Wilson decides to go back to the TVA, in which they hug it out. He calls him his friend. And there's these like big grand send-offs and stuff But these guys really haven't known each other that long. Some of this stuff feels really odd and unearned. Before Mobius decides to take the temp pad back to the TVA to tell everybody the truth and kind of overthrow the authority there, that is, he says this thing about it's never too late to change to older classic Loki, who's certainly gotten more depth than anybody else in this episode. And Sylvie and Loki try to take on this giant monster that Loki tries to distract. It doesn't work. The thing's closing in. Classic Loki comes in, puts up this big grand scale illusion of Asgard that convinces the beast it's real, results in his sacrifice, and Loki and Sylvia are able to succeed as she kind of enchants this thing, and they get a look beyond to the castle in the far. Either King is waiting for them, because there's so many King nods throughout this whole show and everything with Renslayer and all these other Easter eggs. It's either King in that castle, or because this whole show's about Loki, and for some reason they've been hell-bent on going after all these Lokis, maybe it's actually a King Loki instead of King. Especially since they go on to reveal that Renslayer doesn't actually know who's behind the TVA and all that, and that seems a little bit odd, a little bit out of line with the stuff they set up. And that really leads me to thinking that maybe King isn't actually behind this whole thing, that it's more likely a Loki, since this whole show is about a Loki, and Renslayer will probably just go on to team up with King later down the line. So I did enjoy this episode, average at best like 5 out of 10. It's not as bad as episode 3, but it's really just pure fan service with little progress made. Let me know your thoughts and opinions. If you liked it, I'm glad you liked it. I'm glad you loved it. I just not impressed with this show. Let me know your thoughts and opinions. Like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. Stay awesome. Rock on.